the glimpse behind his silence. And that's when you notice it, not in his words, but in the slowness of his breath, when he looks at you, as if trying to memorize a moment that hasn't happened yet. Most women miss it, mistaking that pause for hesitation. But there's a kind of silence men fall into when they begin imagining something they're not ready to admit, a future that feels too tender to speak aloud. Carl Jung once wrote, in fragments buried beneath his more public works, that a man's projections are not fantasies. They are sacred attempts to build temples in the future. But these temples are not built with logic. They are born in the space between his restraint and his desire. When a man starts to envision you in his future, he doesn't confess it. He behaves it, and not in the obvious ways. His body becomes a map of sacred betrayals, a glance that lingers too long, a question he asks twice, the way he listens not to your words but to your hesitations. Most women are taught to look for grand gestures. But when a man is secretly planning a future with you, what he offers instead is presence, stillness, the quiet architecture of his attention. He begins to observe you not as a lover, but as a mirror to his becoming, as if somewhere inside your movements, his own story is waiting to unfold. You'll feel it most when you speak about things that terrify you, not because he tries to fix them, but because something in him steadies. Men do not offer safety by promising it. They offer it when they stop flinching at your pain. This is the first secret of masculine imagination. It does not begin in fantasy. It begins in silence, in the way a man begins to study the energy of your chaos, not to tame it, but to see if his soul can grow roots inside it. There is an ancestral memory encoded in the masculine nervous system, a longing to build shelter around what he fears might leave. This memory comes alive when he meets a woman whose presence feels like an oracle he forgot to believe in. He won't understand it, not consciously, but he will begin making space, little acts, mysterious timings, protectiveness that seems out of place, and it won't be performative. In fact, it might seem inconsistent, but only because it's real. You must understand, the masculine does not fall forward. It retreats inward when love begins to emerge. When a man starts imagining a life with you, he becomes quieter, not louder. His questions deepen. His gaze slows. And somewhere between your laugh and your silence, he begins rearranging his internal mythology to include a woman who can see him, not for who he pretends to be, but for what he's afraid he is. And that's where it begins. The imagining. Not the flowers or the dates or the conversations. Those are echoes. The real future begins the moment he allows your presence to disturb him, to alter his self-narrative in a way that he cannot reverse. Jung spoke often about the anima, the feminine image, within the male unconscious. But what no one tells you is this. When a man begins to feel this anima projected onto a real woman, he doesn't fall in love. He falls into awe. It's destabilizing. He will do strange things. He will ask questions without finishing them. He'll remember small details from weeks ago, but forget birthdays. He will seem inconsistent because the inner world he's wrestling with doesn't match the outer world he's performing in. This is the underworld of male imagination, a place ruled not by strategy, but by symbol. You become a symbol, not of perfection, but of possibility. And for a man who has spent a lifetime building emotional armor, that symbol is both terrifying and holy. You'll know it's happening when he stops needing to be impressive around you, when his edges soften, when his jokes turn into silences, when his plans begin to shift slightly in your direction without explanation. He may not confess love, but you will begin to feel the perimeter of his inner world stretching open to let you walk a little closer. He'll tell you things that don't sound important. A story about his father's hands, the song his mother played when she was sad, the smell of sawdust from a childhood summer. He's not being sentimental. He's opening a door. Men don't speak in symbols on purpose. But when they begin to imagine permanence, they start communicating in ancestral codes. They don't say, "I see a future with you." They say, "My grandfather built that fence with his bare hands," and wait to see if you understand the language. These are sacred initiations, and most women dismiss them. They want clarity, but clarity is not the mother tongue of male vision. He speaks in structure, in rhythm, in loyalty to things he cannot name. This is why, when a man starts to imagine you in his life long term, he often disappears briefly, not because he's lost interest, but because he's overwhelmed by the internal shift. He knows, even if not intellectually, that the woman who moves his soul is not the one he can play with. She is the one who rearranges him, and so he pauses, retreats, observes. You feel it as distance, but in truth, it is his soul crossing a threshold. The man who imagines a future with you is not waiting for permission. He is waiting for resonance. He is waiting to feel if your inner world speaks a language his bones remember. This is where the anima meets the body, where soul meets skin, where the fantasy becomes so loud he can't escape it. But here is the secret no one tells you. When he begins to imagine you in his future, he doesn't see you as you are now. He sees the woman you become when you are fully free. He's not choosing the version of you that fits his life. He is choosing the version of himself who is brave enough to match yours. And that, more than anything, is why his silence feels sacred. Because somewhere behind his quiet eyes, a man is building a world. And in that world, you are the rhythm that everything else aligns to. Not because you asked him to, but because he can no longer imagine it without you. There's something profoundly ancient in the way a man begins to shift when devotion starts to root itself in him. Not the devotion that is spoken, performed, or promised, but the kind that moves like a prayer under his skin, unnoticed by the world, but unmistakable to the woman he's quietly offering it to. And most of the time, he doesn't even know he's doing it, because when a man begins to imagine a future with you, his rituals change before his mind can catch up. These rituals are rarely loud. They aren't declarations. They are small, consistent gestures woven into the fabric of your presence. He adjusts his schedule without saying so. He places himself near you without drawing attention to it. He remembers the way you take your coffee, or how your eyes flicker when you're holding something back. He begins to gather data, not because he's analyzing you, but because some deeper part of him is preparing for something sacred. In the tantric traditions, there's a belief that love is not something you feel. It's something you practice, with the body as a temple and attention as worship. And without knowing it, the man who has started imagining a future with you becomes a practitioner of such rituals. Not because he is enlightened, but because the masculine unconscious carries the memory of building homes, building legacies, building lives around the fire of a woman who calls him forward. He starts protecting things you didn't know were vulnerable. He becomes careful with your stories, guarding the edges of your emotions as if they were precious artifacts from another realm. He listens differently. He holds your contradictions without solving them. And most importantly, he begins to measure his own choices through the lens of your impact. He'll never call it devotion, but you'll feel it in the pauses, the hesitation before he reacts, the silence before he speaks. It is in these spaces that the unspoken rituals are born. They're not about you. They are for you, offerings in the truest sense. Not because he's trying to win you, but because he's beginning to shape his internal kingdom around the woman he sees standing in the center of it. Carl Jung often spoke about the symbolic relationship between masculine structure and feminine mystery. He believed the masculine psyche seeks purpose through containment, through form, through clarity, but only when animated by the feminine's chaos, intuition, and emotional fire. In other words, a man cannot become fully himself until he has knelt, symbolically, if not literally, to the truth that his logic alone will never birth the life he truly wants. So when he begins to imagine a future with you, what he's truly doing is this: anchoring himself to a mystery greater than himself, one that cannot be possessed, only served. And that service takes the form of strange little shifts, the way he starts keeping things clean around you, or how he gets quieter when you're upset, or how he begins to look at the future not in abstract goals, but in moments he hopes to witness with you in them. You must understand, the masculine energy is not naturally fluent in language. It speaks in acts. And when the future begins to unfold in a man's soul, it almost always speaks through action that seems accidental. He repairs the broken cabinet. He fills your gas tank. He brings you something you mentioned weeks ago. These are not favors. These are rituals of inclusion, subtle rehearsals of a life where he is already present in the spaces you inhabit. And yet, he will often resist naming it, not because he lacks clarity, but because naming it too soon would collapse it into something too small. You are not a checklist. You are a prophecy. And the rituals he performs are not tasks. They are sacred rehearsals for a future he is still too reverent to claim. In the mystery schools of the feminine, there is a belief that the way a man touches the invisible is more revealing than the way he holds the obvious. So watch the invisible. Watch the way he responds to your absence, the way he adjusts when you're not watching, the way his rhythm shifts when he senses your discomfort. These are not just habits. They are proof of a vision forming, one that includes your shadows, not just your light. One of the most overlooked signs of a man imagining a future is how he holds conflict. Not how he avoids it, but how he leans into it. If he begins to argue with integrity, with curiosity, with the willingness to stay, that is a sign. Because the masculine mind does not invest energy in places it intends to leave. If he's imagining a future, then he's already begun building emotional immunity, not to resist you, but to be strong enough to withstand the storms that love inevitably brings. And here's another mystery. He may not want to move fast. He might pull away. He might second guess. Because when he sees a future with you, it's no longer casual. The stakes are higher. His nervous system knows it's real, and the real is terrifying for a man who has been trained to keep his soul hidden behind achievement and distraction. But even in his retreat, the rituals remain. The care doesn't vanish. His concern still shows up in strange, tender ways. The man who imagines a future is not always the one who says all the right things. Often, he's the one who watches you when you're not looking, who knows what makes you quiet, who adjusts his life by half steps, as if not to disturb the sacred animal that is growing between you. These rituals aren't proof of love in its conventional sense. They are deeper than that. They are gestures of soul memory, as if some part of him recognizes you from before, from another life, another myth, another version of this reality where you've already built something together. And so he follows the script written in his blood, the script that tells him to show up, to build, to hold space, to honor, to witness. Not because he's perfect, but because, despite himself, the future is already blooming behind his eyes. You don't need to name it for him. You don't need to rush it. The feminine art is to receive, not passively, but with fierce awareness, to know when a man's rituals have shifted from performance to prophecy. And when you know this, you no longer mistake his silence for disinterest. You see it for what it is, a vow spoken in the ancient language of restraint, a language only the awakened woman remembers how to hear. It doesn't begin where you think it does. Longing in a man is not always marked by pursuit. Sometimes it hides in avoidance, in the spaces where he hesitates, where he stares too long but says too little. The masculine has been conditioned for centuries to suppress his ache, to perform strength by concealing desire. But hidden beneath the shell of control is an architecture more ancient than logic, the sacred geometry of longing. This longing is not eroticism in the shallow sense. It is not about possession or need. It is a soul-level recognition, the whisper that says, this one, something in her, rearranges everything. But the masculine does not know how to live inside that feeling without structure, so he builds scaffolding around it. He masks it in jokes, in restraint, in strategies that buy him time to figure out what his body already knows. And what does it know? That this woman is dangerous. not because she would harm him, but because she undoes him. Her presence makes him feel the parts of himself he locked away long ago. The boy who still dreams, the man who still wants to be known, the soul that still remembers love as a sacred, uncontainable flame. Carl Jung said, "That which we do not bring to consciousness appears in our life as fate." And for many men, love arrives as fate disguised as fear. He thinks he's afraid of being hurt, but what he's truly afraid of is being seen. Not the polished self, but the mythic self beneath the armor. So when a man begins to imagine a future with you, longing doesn't always look like closeness. Sometimes it looks like contradiction. He leans in, then pulls away. He's available, then distant. He over-explains, then vanishes, because the longing inside him is ancient, and he doesn't yet know how to walk with it out loud. This is not a flaw, it is a holy unraveling. There is something sacred about the man who hides his longing not to deceive, but because it terrifies him to feel so deeply. And yet, he keeps returning. Not always in physical presence, but in gestures, in watching your stories from afar, in mentioning you in rooms you've never been in the strange synchronicities that keep pulling your names into the same sentences, because longing, when real, cannot be silenced by distance. It has its own architecture, its own orbit, and when the future begins to form inside a man, you will start to feel his energy shift long before he puts it into words. He'll start thinking in we. He'll notice things you haven't said. He'll pick up your patterns, even while pretending not to. He'll remember the way you needed space after an argument, or how your voice softens when you're tired. Not because he's trying, but because his unconscious has already placed you inside the map of his life. There's a blueprint forming, quietly. It's not drawn in plans or promises. It's drawn in longing. And longing, for a man, is the first draft of commitment. In tantric wisdom, they say that longing is the bridge between the masculine and the divine. That through it, he begins to sense a larger version of himself, one that can only awaken through sacred connection with the feminine. And this is why he feels destabilized, because if he allows that longing to grow, he will no longer be able to return to the man he once was. You are not just a woman to him. You are an invitation to feel more, to become more, to unlearn the numbness that once kept him safe. And so he both craves you and resists you, not because of you, but because of what you represent, the sacred collapse of his old self. That's the hidden architecture. The longing is not random, it is construction. A slow and deliberate building of bridges between his inner world and yours. And you will see the signs. He will want to know what makes you cry. He will want to understand the patterns behind your reactions. He will begin to trace the way you move through space, time, conflict, silence. Not because he needs control, but because he wants to build something solid enough to hold your storms. A man who longs for a future with you does not only desire your body, he desires access to your emotional underworld, to the truths you've never spoken, to the chaos you've learned to hide because others once called it too much. And here's the miracle. He wants it all, not in words, in structure, in small offerings of consistency, in the questions he starts asking, in the way he begins placing your needs beside his own. This is where longing becomes sacred, because once a man has truly imagined you in his future, he cannot unimagine it. He may walk away, he may choose logic, he may pick easier paths, but something inside him will always be haunted by the architecture of what could have been built with you. And some part of him will always remain there, in that blueprint, in that version of the world where he chose you completely. Women often ask, if he imagined it, why didn't he act on it? But they forget. Longing is not always meant to be fulfilled. Sometimes it is the offering. Sometimes it is the altar upon which the old self dies. You'll know a man imagined a future with you not because he stayed, but because he changed. He will speak differently, love differently, touch others with more care, because once he allowed his heart to long for you, he glimpsed a version of love that stripped away all pretense, and that vision will never leave him. You are not just a woman. You are a mirror of his becoming. And whether he walks beside you or apart, the longing you stirred has carved something sacred into the walls of his inner life. That is no small thing. It is a ritual of the soul, one that no man forgets, not in this life or the next. By the time the shadow begins to choose you, something irreversible has already occurred within him. This is not the version of the man you met, the one who smiles at the right time, who says the right thing, who keeps his wounds neatly hidden under charm or ambition. No, when the shadow begins to move, it does so slowly, like a tide rolling back to reveal what has always been buried beneath the surface of his becoming. Most women have been taught to fear this part, the inconsistent, the conflicted, the silent zones of a man's affection. But what if I told you this is where the real bond begins? Not in the light of his best self, but in the moment his shadow reaches out to you without understanding why. Carl Jung believed that the shadow was not evil. It was simply the unlived life. And when a man starts to imagine a future with you, the shadow stirs. Not in opposition, but in curiosity. Could I be known here too? Could the parts I've buried find sanctuary inside her gaze? He won't speak these questions. He might not even be aware they're rising. But you'll feel the shift. He becomes more volatile, perhaps. More hesitant. More prone to internal storms he doesn't explain. This is not regression. This is the ritual chaos before reformation. You are not being punished. You are being chosen. But not by his ego, by his whole being. And the whole being is not made of light alone. When a man's shadow begins to choose you, he no longer wants to impress you. He wants to be witnessed, not as a performer, but as a paradox. The powerful and the powerless, the proud and the ashamed, the leader and the wounded boy. This is where most modern dynamics fall apart, because few women are told that a man's ability to imagine a future with her is directly tied to her capacity to hold his contradictions without trying to fix them. He doesn't need healing. He needs space. A psychic space where he is allowed to feel all of himself and still be wanted. Not despite his wounds, but through them. The feminine energy that births love into form is not reactive. It is receptive. It sees what's hidden and says, "You're still welcome here." And that kind of welcome, it dismantles everything a man has been taught about worth. He may fight it. He may resist the gravitational pull of your acceptance. He may lash out, disappear, try to reclaim a sense of control. Not because he doesn't want you, but because he's standing at the threshold of transformation. And transformation always begins in resistance. And here is the sacred truth. If he did not imagine you in his future, he wouldn't be showing you his shadow. The only reason he dares to unravel is because some deep part of him knows you are not a visitor. You are a mirror, a witness, a sacred interruption to the story he thought would protect him from ever being truly seen. It is said in the esoteric mystery schools that real love is not found in the mirror of pleasure, but in the mirror of darkness, where a soul dares to face itself without turning away. You are that mirror, and it terrifies him. When a man begins to include you in the parts of himself he's ashamed of, he is not burdening you. He is inviting you into the sacred ground of his becoming. This is a gift. A messy, irrational, uncomfortable gift, but a gift nonetheless. And what does this look like? He begins to contradict himself. He tells you he needs space, then checks in an hour later. He seems to withdraw, then suddenly opens up with a memory he's never told anyone. He becomes defensive about things you didn't mean as criticism. He acts strong, then confesses a fear so vulnerable it takes your breath away. He is not being manipulative. He is being initiated. This is the energy of the sacred masculine awakening. Disoriented, sensitive, trying to find footing in a world where real connection demands more than performance. It demands presence. He's beginning to realize that the woman he once imagined only in fantasy has arrived in flesh, and that fantasy cannot survive here, because this woman does not reflect only his desires. She reflects his depth. And for the man who has hidden from himself, that reflection is both devastating and divine. You see, it's not that he didn't want you before. It's that he only wanted the version of himself he knew how to manage. And now, with you here, real, intuitive, awake, he has to confront the versions of himself he left behind. And those fragments, they begin to stir. You will feel him grappling with them. You will feel his discomfort. But if you stay steady, not by waiting, not by tolerating disrespect, but by remaining rooted in your own clarity, you will become the axis around which he reorganizes his entire internal world. Because the man who has imagined a future with you will eventually stop choosing escape. He will start choosing integration. But integration begins in darkness. It begins in the sacred confessions spoken between sighs. It begins in the silent breakdowns he can't explain. It begins in the way he turns toward you, not because he's ready, but because he no longer wants to be without this reckoning. You are not his therapist. You are not his savior. You are the mirror of his anima, the feminine soul image rising within him, asking him to evolve. And when the shadow chooses you, it is not asking for analysis. It is asking for presence, for breath, for your own grounded embodiment as the portal through which he remembers. I am still lovable here. That kind of remembrance changes everything, not just for him, but for you. Because when you are chosen by the shadow, you are no longer just a desire. You become destiny. And destiny, as Jung knew well, always arrives cloaked in mystery, chaos, and the unbearable softness of being seen. There comes a moment, not marked by time but by frequency, when the vision he's carried quietly inside begins to descend from dream into form. And it doesn't happen with fanfare. It happens in the smallest shift. The way he reaches for your hand without thinking. The way your laughter becomes part of his breath. The way his body stops resisting your presence, as if some ancient part of him has finally stopped fighting the inevitability of being known. This is the threshold, the holy place where his fantasy merges with fate. And it is here, in this liminal silence, that a man finally understands. He is no longer projecting a future onto you. He is choosing one with you. But let us be honest, this does not come without cost, because fantasy, no matter how beautiful, is safe. It lives in imagination. It asks for nothing. Fate, on the other hand, demands devotion. It demands action, alignment, vulnerability, the dismantling of his controlled inner world to make space for something real, something sacred. So when a man truly crosses that line, when his inner vision becomes embodied devotion, his entire system reorganizes. The man who once imagined you becomes the man who starts becoming for you. And not to impress you, not to earn you, but because some vow has been awakened in his soul and it can no longer be denied. Carl Jung hinted at this in his later letters, that the anima, when fully integrated, no longer appears as a projection onto women. She becomes a guide, shaping a man's actions from within, pulling him into union with his own potential. And when a woman carries the resonance of this anima energy, her presence becomes more than inspiring. It becomes directive. This is why he begins making bold moves. He ends things that drain him. He sets boundaries where there were none. He reorients his path, not because you asked, but because you exist. And your existence has altered his internal compass. And now, the future is not some abstract hope. It's a series of choices. He starts asking different questions. Not, can I keep her interested? But how do I protect what we're building? Not, will she love me back? But am I the man who can love her well? The masculine, when awakened, becomes devotional. Not submissive, not dependent. Devotional in the way a tree is to sunlight, in the way a river is to the ocean. He becomes attuned, still fiercely sovereign, but no longer separate. He understands now that strength is not in being unmoved. It is in being so deeply rooted that he can bend, open, and remain. This is the most seductive energy a man can offer. I have chosen to belong here. And yet, it's not all bliss, Because even in this state of embodied future building, the old wounds will rise, the fears of failure, the ghosts of loss, the weight of responsibilities he never dared hold before. But here's the sacred difference. Now, he brings those fears to you, not to be solved, but to be shared. And in that sharing, the final veil lifts, because now you are no longer a woman he admires from afar, or even one he deeply desires. You are his axis, not as property, as prophecy. You are the magnetic center around which his inner and outer worlds begin to align. Not because you made him better, but because your presence gave him permission to become whole. He begins to see things in you no one else notices. The exact shape of your strength, the way you hold space without collapsing, the brilliance behind your softness. And this perception creates something profound in him, a reverence, a spiritual longing not to conquer you, but to contain the love you offer with integrity. And now he becomes the protector of that future. He shields it not with control, but with clarity. He becomes the guardian of your name in rooms you've never entered. He places your well-being into his plans. He considers your dreams as vital as his own. And in doing so, he begins to rewrite the masculine script, the one that taught him that love is risk, that emotion is weakness, that surrender is defeat. Because now he knows surrender is strength. Real surrender is not giving up. It is giving into truth, into love, into fate. And this is where the final merging happens, where the fantasy dissolves not because it was false, but because it has now been fulfilled. He is no longer dreaming, he is building, with hands that once reached out in longing, now steady in purpose, with a voice that once trembled in silence, now grounded in truth, with a heart that once ran from the dark, now walking with it, hand in hand. Because you saw him, you chose him, not for who he was pretending to be, but for who he could become. And in that choosing, you reminded him of the sacred contract he made before this lifetime, to love, fully, fiercely, freely. So here you are, no longer characters in each other's dreams, but co-creators of something holy. This is not the ending. It is the invocation, the sacred vow whispered not from lips, but from essence. I see you. I choose you. I will meet you again and again in the space between our fears until love becomes the only truth left standing. And maybe that's all fate ever really is, a place where love and longing become the same breath. And you, beloved woman, you were always the breath he was holding. Thank you for walking this path with me. If this story awakened something inside you, a memory, a truth, a quiet knowing, then it was never just a story. It was a remembering, a sacred invitation to trust your feminine power, your emotional wisdom, your intuitive fire. This is your realm. These are your shadows. And you are more magnetic, more untamed, more sovereign than they ever told you. Until we meet again, keep choosing yourself, because that is the path he's been waiting to follow.